Hello, everyone. I'm Bahari. I'm the editor of Iran Wair. We have a very special guest today. We have Mr. Ivan Morovic, who is an organizer, software developer, scholar. And the reason we are talking to Ivan is not because of those attributions. Ivan was one of the leaders of Outpour movement, and the Outpour movement, which was the student group that were instrumental in downfall of Slobodan Milosevic in 2000 in Serbia. And Ivan, thank you very much for accepting to be interviewed. I know that you're very busy. And the first question is that I just want to cut the chase and get to the main point. You are now the director of International Center for Nonviolent Conflict. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Many Iranians, when we talk about nonviolence, they're saying that nonviolent movements can be successful in countries with a bit of space like Ukraine, like Georgia, even in Tunisia. But when it comes to brutal dictatorships like Saddam Hussein's Iraq or Assad's Syria or the Islamic Republic, you have to go for an eye for an eye. That nonviolence resistance is not effective. What do you tell them?
Well, thanks again for having me, and it's an honor. I have to say, coming from Serbia, a country, not just Serbia, but the whole region of the Balkans that experienced so many wars and conflicts, I approach the question of violence versus non-violence from a position of like, what is possible? And when we look at these brutal dictators, and I used to live in a dictatorship of Slobodan Milosevic that didn't just cause harm to our people, but it was responsible for war crimes in Bosnia and in Kosovo, and they were really capable of mass murder, of atrocities. The question is, when we go into a conflict with such a dictator, and if we choose something as a method of struggle, let's say violence, they are much better equipped, much better skilled, and much better motivated, and they don't have any scruples at all. And this was shown many times. So in a question of violence versus non-violence is a question of like, what is it that we as civilian population are capable of doing, rather than what we would like to do or what we think would be most appropriate. However, this is kind of just looking at it from our perspective. But if we look at the let's say data, if we look at the historical record, we can see that nonviolent movements proved to be twice as effective than violent movements. And yes, maybe, if you use the example of Saddam Hussein's Iraq, that was toppled through foreign invasion, but we saw Bashir's Sudan that was toppled, or Bashir in Sudan was toppled through a popular uprising by their own people. So in a sense, we can find examples to support each of the claims. But if we look at like the overall trend, it shows that non-violent movements were twice as successful than violent movements, at least when we look at the 20th and the early 21st century.
So when the police beats up protesters, when the police shoots at people, when the police murders people, arrest them and torture them, what do you tell those protesters? Do you tell them that remain non-violent? And how should they resist non-violently to such brutality?
That's a great question. As you pointed in the question already, they are going to use torture. They're going to use violence, and they're going to use such measures regardless of what we do. So it doesn't matter whether we are going to be violent or non-violent. The regime that is kind of ready to use kind of excessive force, to use not just violence but torture and human rights violations of different kinds, they're going to do it. So the question, when we choose our tactics and when we decide which method to use, our main concern should be what methods are going to increase the participation of the people. So if we want to win against an adversary that is organized, well-funded, skilled to use violence, and has the weapons necessary for that, the only thing that we have on our end is numbers, population, people who are on our side. So the reason why we are advocating non-violent action, and I wouldn't call it non-violent action. It's a how should I say? It's a mass, broad-based, popular mobilization of the people. And when we trying to mobilize thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, that by definition will be unarmed, because those people, civilian population, they don't have the arms, and they don't have the military training, and they don't have the military organization. So in a sense, we are going to end up with a non-violent movement, just if we want to do mass mobilization. And in a sense, that's why I always go back to that. Whenever there is a crackdown, whenever there is a mass arrest, and I've been arrested myself personally many times, the question was not what the police is going to do or what the regime is going to do, but what is it that we can do to increase the number of people who are mobilized and who are participating in the movement, because that's the only way we can fight back against torturers, against murderers, and against criminals in the regime. That is the only, how shall I say, argument that they will accept. If they see a lot of people on the other side, if they see that they're in the minority, this is when they're going to start to scrap.
So I guess you're talking about legitimacy, because even the most rigid dictatorships and authoritarian regimes like the Nazis or the one in North Korea or Stalin, they are seeking legitimacy and they pretend to be legitimate. And I guess what you're saying is that mass protest against these regimes, mass nonviolent protest against these regimes, take away that legitimacy from them.
Yes, indeed. But that's only the first step. So when I said mass mobilization, I deliberately avoided the word mass protest, because protest is in most cases just the first step. You know, people go into the street to protest because they think that, you know, they should be heard and their grievances should be voiced. And they want to kind of make sure that they're noticed and that like people take note of what is going on. But usually the regime doesn't care. Like they're not listening to complaints, they're not listening to protests, they're not listening to demands, and they may even decide to do a crackdown. So successful movements move very quickly from protest to non-cooperation. So rather than just going into the streets to protest, which is like very, very risky and very dangerous because of the crackdown, as I said, people move to different forms of non-cooperation: boycott, strikes, denying of kind of classic consent that citizens usually do. People stop paying taxes, they stop supplying the regime with resources, and this is very difficult for the regime to counter, because if I go into the streets, they can push me, arrest me, whatever. But if I stop performing my duties as a citizen, it's very difficult for them to make me do that. So, for instance, in our case, in Serbia, the things that we did was we were organizing slowly strikes in different professions, which culminated with the general strike, where even the miners in the Kolubara mines that is supplying our electricity production with coal, when they went on strike. And that meant that like Serbia had only 4 or 5 days electricity, coal for electricity. So in a sense, it doesn't matter what the regime wants or what the regime is trying to do. When people are refusing to work, then it's difficult to maintain the operations of the country. So what they did then is they sent the military to take over the mines, and citizens organized to protect the miners, but the military cannot operate the mines. That is another problem. It's like they need people who know how to do it. So it's actually very difficult to go against non-cooperation. And so protest regimes know what to do with. Non-cooperation, it's much more difficult. And then there is the third step, where actually it's the most important part of building power for movements. And this is when people start building their own parallel institutions. So these are, for instance, committees, neighborhood committees. There are like cases in different countries where they were going as far as to do like a parallel schools, parallel media, parallel institutions that actually then it didn't really matter what the regime was trying to do, because people started building their own power, and that made it difficult even for the crackdown or any kind of how shall I say mass arrest or anything to stop that from kind of shifting the power balance.
So in a sense, I guess what you're also warning people in terms of the protest and mobilization is to be aware of agitators who may want to make the protest violent in order for the government and the regimes to take advantage of it. And that is something that we have seen in Iran repeatedly in the past 2 decades. Have you come across such examples in Serbia and other countries?
Yes, actually in Serbia, one of the most damaging, how shall I say, elements of the movement were those that had a very radical self-defeating strategy. And for instance, if we manage to mobilize a lot of people, and especially like at one point, we actually managed to mobilize people who were not really seen as members of the movement. So these were like people who were like retired, elderly. They started joining the movement. I think it happened because we were students, younger, and so there was like a natural connection between us and our grandparents. So we started doing a lot of joint actions with the organizations of retired people, and because they were suffering their retirement, their pensions were very low, their retirement was very difficult, and then we would have people who would go in and give speeches in which they would demand like very, very radical violent action, where all the retired people would run away and go home. So we actually understood that the reason why these speeches were given and why the advocates for more violent action were sent was to actually undermine our effort to bring in the elderly people, because the elderly people, they were not interested in any of that stuff.
So what are the tenets of nonviolent resistance, if you want to list them?
Yeah. So first tenet is that, and this is why, in English, they call it nonviolent resistance. For instance, in my language, we would call it unarmed resistance. And the reason why we call it unarmed is that it's the tool for a civilian population that doesn't have what those violent thugs associated with the regime do have, and that is the ability to use violence. So
and I guess by non-armed, you mean both firearms or
exactly
like knives or hammers or brass knuckles, etc.
Exactly. So not just firearms, but actually the reason why we call it like that is because ordinary people, majority of the population, as I mentioned, elderly already, but also women, also young adults, like students, like people who are not didn't do military training, they're not part of a street gang, they're just ordinary citizens. They're not equipped to use violence and to use political violence. So there is a very small percentage of the population that actually uses political violence and benefits from it. And these are the ones who would like political violence to be dominant, because then they can rule. So the first tenet of nonviolent resistance, civil resistance, is that it is about people power. It is about numbers. It is about the majority of the population. And the method needs to match the capabilities of those people. Because if we have those people on our side, through non-cooperation, we will deny any regime ability to rule. So this is kind of the which brings me to the second tenet, and second tenet is in that non-cooperation, and that is that we can deny.
So the first tenet is mass protest and mass
mobilization.
The second tenet is non-cooperation.
Non-cooperation.
And sorry, because I'm asking questions that people are asking me. So in terms of non-cooperation, do you regard sabotage as non-cooperation as well?
So that depends, to tell you the truth. There is no, how shall I say, there is no one answer, let's say, for that. And I will give you couple of examples. So, for instance, we've seen, for instance, that the simple blockade of the bridge can backfire on protesters who are blocking the bridge if they don't let an ambulance go through. So when we do that, we need to make sure that, we respect people who are, how should I say, in dire need. So sabotage, it really depends what kind of sabotage. If sabotage is hurting the civilian population, that is, how should I say, totally different than when sabotage is aimed at somebody else. So I'll give you an
cooperation
example.
Has to be people who are not cooperating. They also have to have the public interest in mind.
Exactly.
So you are not sabotaging. You're not stopping ambulances. You're not destroying public property that can be used for people, hospitals, etc.
Yes. But I'll give you an example of a sabotage that actually worked really well. And it's also from Serbia. They were the regime was trying to build the small hydroelectric plants where they would put like a whole river, like a small river, into a pipe, and then divert that pipe to a hydroelectric plant that would be, used by some regime connected businessmen. So people would go there, and then they would destroy that pipe, and then they would let the river come through. That kind of sabotage, everybody agreed was an appropriate one. So it really depends when we talk about what kind of a sabotage we are talking about. And the same thing goes with any other property destruction. So property destruction in general is seen as problematic, but it really depends on the circumstances that we are dealing with. What we need to have in mind is that what we are doing as a movement needs to be in the service of the population, in the service of the general society, and in the service of the next one, going from non-cooperation to shifting power balance. So this is important, that we shift the balance of power from the regime towards the movement. And this is where, how shall I say, when we look at these tactics, let's say sabotage or property destruction or any of that, or even violence, they usually don't shift the power balance. What shifts the power balance is actually going back to the first one, and that is increasing the number of supporters, increasing the numbers of the members of the movement.
Well, Ivan, I think that we have covered a lot of ground in this interview. Many of our readers, many of our audience members, they've been asking us to provide them with information about nonviolent resistance, especially union activists, teachers, and some students who believe that violence and destruction of property can be counterproductive. And I think you've answered many of those questions beautifully. I think what we can do is that I will ask you the last question, but I'd like to ask the audience members to send us more questions. And then maybe another session, if you don't mind, we can cover those. And also, I would love to talk to you about your experiences in Serbia. But my last question is that you've been following the events in Iran in the past few days. And in fact, you've been following the events in Iran since 2009 Green Movement. I know you've been in touch with some activists. What are your recommendations? What are your advices to your Iranian friends inside the country?
Yes, we are all inspired by what we see in Iran, and the courage and the determination and persistence is really something that we can all learn from. It's a difficult struggle. I mean, the most movements take a very long time to create a meaningful change, and especially in entrenched regimes, which are not how shall I say, they're not willing to listen, let's say. So in a sense, the persistence needs to be even greater. And I have noticed that there are things happening around the world lately, especially this year, where finally that kind of decline of democratic trends, the resurgence of dictatorship, the things are worse than they were 10 years ago or 15 years ago. But we have reached a point where the tide is turning, and we can see that with what is happening in Ukraine, and the Russian war, how it's going badly for Putin. We are seeing it in China with the people demanding that they don't have to pay the mortgages for the apartments that were never built for them, that the money was just stolen by the regime, and we can see it in Iran with this process. So there is something is happening in the world, and I am very, very optimistic that the tide is turning, and that the resurgence of authoritarianism that we have seen about to end.
Do you have any specific advice for Iranians based on your observations in the past few days?
So what I can say, and this is also from the experience that I have from Serbia, is that, you know, finding ways to peel off the different like pillars of support, different organizations and institutions that are propping up the regime through non-cooperation, actually is the kind of the best way to solidify the movement and to create the power shifts. So I am kind of looking forward to seeing how this non-cooperation may play out in Iran through, you know, there are different tactics of non-cooperation, like, you know, boycotts and strikes and other forms of civil disobedience. But I am, how shall I say, really again inspired by what I see and the courage and determination of the
especially women,
and especially women. Yes.
Well, thank you, Ivan. Thank you so much. We'll make sure that to visit you very soon and ask you more questions based on our audience members' questions. Thank you so much, Ivan Maurovic. And خیلی ممنون برای دیدن این برنامه. امیدوارم که سوالاتون رو برای آقای ماروویچ بفرستید و بتونیم از اطلاعات ایشون و تجربه هایشون استفاده کنیم.